Hi, this is Lupe Prado. I am a career and life coach, and you're listening to Paid Vocation. In this podcast, I'll be sharing real stories of people who are doing work they love to help you find work that you love, whether that's a new role at your current company, switching careers completely, or starting a business. And if you're already doing work that you love, this podcast will be a place that you can come back to feel supported and uplifted. Thank you so much for listening. Gloria, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Lupe.
So I like to start every interview by asking guests, as a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, I was such a loud and crazy kid. I actually wanted to be a comedian.
Fun.
I love telling jokes and make people happy. Nothing makes me happier than seeing other people happy. So I'm glad I didn't go down that path. I don't think I have quite what it takes, but I was the one always at dinner parties, like entertaining people and being loud. I've definitely chilled out since then, though.
Well, and how do you think that connects to what you do today? And do you mind sharing what you do today?
Yeah. So, I mean, if anyone wants to hear about a crazy career transition story, this is for them. So, I used to be a US diplomat and I transitioned from government work into full on like entrepreneur work. Kind of had like a midlife crisis, if you will, moved back home, gave up my pension and my quote unquote comfortable, prestigious career to start something on my own. So now I'm an entrepreneur and I have a PR coaching membership, which helps female founders, especially women of color, get seen in the media by teaching them how to be their own publicist. I also have a podcast as well. So very, very different than diplomacy.
Well, tell me, Gloria, that's so interesting because I have a lot of questions just as you started sharing your story already. How did you get into US diplomat?
So I grew up in a bilingual, bicultural household. My mother is an immigrant from China. And so I always wanted to do something that was international. And I remember like I always took the language classes, the culture classes. Like in college, I studied abroad in South Africa. I wanted to
Oh,
go
cool.
somewhere that while most people were going to Europe, I wanted to go somewhere else. So I always had this international flair to me. And I
Mhm.
always wanted to be surrounded by people who were different from me. So I thought naturally, international relations, that was going to be my thing. And so I studied international relations and I actually wanted to be a documentary filmmaker. And when that failed, I was like, okay, let's get a real job.
So you were telling me about how you got into US diplomacy.
Yeah, so I always studied international relations and I studied abroad in South Africa. I always wanted to be proximate to people who were different from me.
Mm.
And growing up in a bicultural household, I spoke Chinese, spoke English. I always wanted to just explore. And so I studied international relations. I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker at one point. I remember being a very enthusiastic 18-year-old high school grad. I had my camcorder with me and I went into the red light district in Thailand. I was interviewing sex workers. Social activism was very big for me. So
Mm.
when the documentary film career didn't really turn out, I was like, okay, it's time to get like a real job. And I applied for a bunch of scholarships. I thought about going back to school and I got a scholarship from the US State Department. And so they actually pre-selected me for the Foreign Service. And so I kind of was sworn in and I had this on track career where I was going to be in for 25 years with a pension, retirement, the whole thing. I went to grad school for political science and I was on my way. But after one tour, I quickly realized that this was not the best environment for me. I think we all have to reckon with our personality. I think my personality is just not that of a bureaucrat. And I was born to be an entrepreneur. And I wish I knew that earlier, but I had to learn just from being in an environment that wasn't for me. And so that was very hard for me because everybody on the outside was like, you have the best career, you have the best insurance, you have all of these things, like a
Mm.
condo that's paid for, you get to travel the world. Like, why are you leaving this? But I was just deeply miserable. And I just realized there are people who like to quote unquote color within the lines. And there are people who would like to be a little bit more creative. And so I'm the latter part. And I'd rather learn and fail and take risks than always going by the playbook. So that was kind of what happened.
Yeah. Well, and tell me, I'm curious. You said your personality wasn't really the right fit for that bureaucrat role. What's a bureaucrat personality more like? I know I used to be an accountant. I didn't have the personality for an accountant,
Mhm.
probably. But I'm curious, what is a bureaucrat personality
I think
usually like?
like very rule following and enjoys doing
Mm.
things the way that it's always been done. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think we need people like that, right? But I think for me, I'm a visionary creative and I've always thrived when there wasn't so much instruction and kind of figured it
Mm.
out. And so I really work well under pressure and work well when things are not so set in stone. Some people like that, but for me, it's like when I travel, for example, I don't like to have my days planned out. I'm really
Mm.
not that type of person. So I think everyone needs to understand like what types of environment do they thrive in? And if they are more creative, then maybe something that is very rigid is not for them. But if someone
Mm.
enjoys the stability and knowing what you're going to do every single day, then government work is perfect.
And tell me, how did you go about figuring out what was next? Did you know automatically it was going to be entrepreneurship? Did you kind of have to experiment? How did you
I
know? How did
wish.
you?
Yeah, so my father was an entrepreneur. He passed away when I was 3, but everyone says I take after him.
Hmm.
And so I didn't really think that I would take after him in terms of entrepreneurship, but it's really funny that I kind of found my way. So
Hmm.
I always loved communications because I was doing, documentary film. I was writing speeches for the ambassador. And so I thought, okay, maybe it's going to be PR because you get to do communications, you get to see people
Hmm.
win. And I'm a natural kind of like pitch person. I always say I'm an unofficial hype woman. So if you go to a hip hop concert, I'm like that woman that's like making the crowd ready, right? I just love being your unofficial hype woman. So I applied for, God, like 1,000 jobs
My
when I
gosh.
was working in government in PR. And they all said, you had a really interesting experience, but we're really looking for someone with the traditional PR agency experience, which I didn't have. But I knew that I had what it takes from a writing standpoint and communication standpoint. And so after getting rejected like 1,000 jobs, I realized like, okay, it's not going to be for me to go the traditional PR route and to work for an agency. And so my friend at the time, who took a sabbatical from diplomacy, was working at this tiny little fintech startup. I had no idea about fintech. I had no idea about startups. But he was like, we're barely launched. We don't have really a lot of budget, but if you want to help get us on NBC and ABC and Wall Street Journal and New York Times, like we're not going to say no, but we're only going to pay you if you get us featured, which by the way, like no PR agency would guarantee that. But I had to start from somewhere. So I said, sure. And so I literally was just sitting with the engineers trying to figure out. So they did this AI enabled analytics risk platform, which again, I had no idea about. So I had to figure out what was a newsworthy story in what they were doing.
Hmm.
And then I had to figure out how to pitch it to the media. But because I didn't have any media contacts, I had no contacts to call up my reporter friends, right?
Hmm.
So I was copy and pasting random email addresses, like spending so much time finding who these journalists are. And because I didn't know them, I had to call the operator at the New York Times, all the way up from the operator up to the newsroom level, and just get so good at cold pitching after being rejected thousands of times and having phone slammed in my face. I started to pick up on, oh, this is what makes the journalist stay on the phone with me, or this is how an email gets responded to. So I came up with my own proprietary pitching method, which is a structure of a cold pitch that has gotten hundreds of founders featured in every industry. And so now I
Hmm.
teach that around the world because my whole thing is like, I had to hack it on my own. And so I'm making it accessible for the everyday small business to do it on their own. So that's how I started my business is I started doing retainer work and now I pivoted to a one-to-many model where we have a community of diverse small businesses in
Hmm.
e-commerce and coaching, and they're all trying to get featured in podcasts and kind of be their own publicist, which honestly is not really often found. Traditionally, you need to pay someone who knows someone. So for me, access is really important. And that's really what I'm trying to do is giving the power back to the small business.
Hmm. Gloria, that sounds like so cool. And this kind of very like straight line. You went from being a US diplomat and then you started your career, you had a ton of success, and now you're here. Tell us about the failures that came or the things that you learned along the way. Because I'm sure if someone's thinking about like pivoting or just wanting to like connect to your story, I'm sure they want to hear about like what is it that you struggled with in that story, right? That figuring that pivot, that change, like
Oh my
tell
God,
tell
it
us
was
about the
so
in between.
it was so hard because I didn't have any media contacts. So I was literally cold calling for hours, dialing the operator, like
Mm,
sweaty palms, trying to get my client on TV. And I think just from getting rejected so many times and being so persistent about it, that's how I picked up on patterns. And I think a lot of times we don't give ourselves that runway to like fail enough to figure out, okay, well, what is working and what's not working. And I
mm,
always think that like cold calling is like one of the top skills that anyone should have, whether it's we learn in high school or college. Like, I wish we were taught this because I really think everything you want is on the other side of that send button. So,
mm,
yeah, it's intimidating to send that email. It's intimidating to pitch yourself. But the more you get comfortable pitching yourself, and I mean cold pitching, the more you realize like it's really not a big deal if they say no. Because
mm.
on the upside of that is learning what works, finding a pattern, and then pitching it. So to me, it's really a volume game. And this is why they pay salespeople a lot because they're willing to be rejected. Right. So I think having that tenacity and being able to be rejected like so many times,
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
lot in there.
Oh, 100%. And I see that with clients all the time too. And in my own life, even starting this
Yeah.
podcast, like pitching people to be on the podcast, being willing to be rejected. Was there any moment, Gloria, where you thought, yeah, I don't know, maybe I should stop? Or was it just
Yeah.
like, I have to make this work? So I'm just going to keep emailing. I'm going to keep cold calling. Was there ever a moment where you thought, okay, that was enough rejection?
It was hard, but I think that when people are depending on you and you literally are like, you have to pay rent and you've already gave up this comfortable career and condo and
Mm.
you're living back home with your parents, you're like, I just got to take whatever I can. And I think they paid me like something ridiculous, like $250 for like a online article and $500 to get them on TV. And I ended up getting them on all the different shows and CNBC and Wall Street Journal and Fortune, all these things. But then I had to do it again and again and again, right? So with
Mm.
each time, it was a lot of rejection and learning like what the business model is to pitch it because I had no clue about that. But I think you learn from your strength is like you don't need to be an expert at that.
Mm.
All you need to do is be a generalist and figure out what is a relative story that's relatable to a journalist, which is who are generalists themselves.
Mm.
So I
Mm.
didn't, even though I had no experience in fintech, right? I was able to pick out the stories that worked. But when I pivoted during COVID, so COVID happened obviously, and nobody wanted to pay a PR agent and any kind of retainer work.
Mm.
So my contracts went poof, like gone.
Mm.
I didn't know where my next penny was going to come from. And I had this lunch with my friend who was in kind of the online fitness space for a while.
Mm.
And she's like, you really got to pivot and stop thinking like a consultant and more like an entrepreneur. You have to stop trading your time for money. And
Mm.
this was a novel concept for me. I didn't really understand what she was saying. And she's
Mhm.
like, how can you productize what you're doing so you can serve many people at once, right? And I was like, I don't even know how to start with that. I don't know anything about online courses. I had no idea what a webinar was. I had no idea how to be a marketer. And so during COVID on our little IKEA desk, me and my husband, like I started to build my business on an
Mm.
old ass laptop, just figuring out, like how to get leads, how to write emails, how to make a sales page. And I think the hardest part was just like learning all of those things and all the little bits and pieces because I didn't have the budget to just
Mm.
hire everyone to do what I wanted. But then
Yeah.
at every level, they always say every level there's a new devil, right? So yes, like I figured it out, but then when it's time to delegate, it's really hard because I'm not a natural born manager or like delegator. Like no one really teaches you how to manage a team. And so that till this day is probably the most humbling lesson is like, okay, you know how to build a business, you know how to get clients results, but how do you build a team? How do you get your team to be accountable? So that is to me one of the hardest things in business is growing a team.
Yeah. So it sounds like you had to pivot again. So you pivoted once from the US diplomat role to becoming
Yeah,
a
yeah,
PR
yeah. PR
coach.
agent. Yeah.
And then you pivoted again when the economy changed, when there was a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic that you couldn't control, that you couldn't hustle to like get more clients if clients weren't. So you had to pivot again. Yeah. Well, and what do you think you learned about yourself, Gloria, through all that?
I think I learned that it's all about your mindset and limiting beliefs because
Mm.
when you start a business, you're like, okay, well, this is what the customer wants. So you have to deliver that. But the whole thing about entrepreneurship is like presenting people with new solutions that maybe they haven't thought before. I mean, that's what an
Mm.
entrepreneur is. I never thought that people would want to quote unquote DIY their PR. I was like, what? I thought people just hired an agency and that's it. But
Mm.
little did I know that no one was solving this problem for small businesses who cannot afford 50 grand in retainers, right? So what's in there for them? So in getting rid of my limiting beliefs of, well, people don't want DIY PR or people want someone else to do it for them. Every single stage, I had to get rid of that mindset and just create something new and give it to my audience and then get
Mm.
feedback. But if I just kept with my level of thinking where it was, there's no way I could have built my community the way it is. And so
Mm.
now it's like, it's a new way of doing PR. No one's really doing this, but we're getting incredible results for people.
Mm.
And I think in order to be an innovator, you have to go first because
Mm.
that's what it means to be an innovator, right? It's like there's really no roadmap for you to follow. And it's hard. It's really hard because I had no clue. There's no one that can tell you this is what you need to do first, next, second. So it was a lot of information all at once. I signed up for all these courses and being an entrepreneur, I think the hardest part is not only manage a team, but also knowing what's the right problem to solve next because you have so many problems. You just have endless problems in life and business. That's what it is. But I think the successful ones know which one to solve in the right order. And
Mm.
so that's really a skill that I'm trying to figure out too for myself.
Mm. Mhm. So you worked on your mindset and your limiting beliefs, obviously through your work, the things you were doing. Was there anything else that you did to help you strengthen your mindset, to challenge the way you were already thinking or that you were thinking, to become aware of those beliefs that were holding you back? Anything specific that you did that might be able to help the audience?
Well, I think building a business is like the most frightening and the most rewarding thing. And I say frightening because there's no roadmap, but then you also see all of your traumas and triggers and scarcity
Mm.
mindsets play out in real life and you see the
Mhm.
ripple effects. Whereas maybe working in corporate, you have a bigger safety net where like it's not really your money that you're playing with. And so from hiring and firing, like I made so many mistakes. I had no clue how to hold people accountable. I thought it was best to be people's friend instead of their,
Mm,
boss. And that was no way to run a business. I felt like, okay, every money I made, I should hold on to it. And so I delayed my growth by not investing properly in my business.
mm,
So I had to do a lot of work around money mindset, around
mm,
worthiness, around letting
mm,
go. And a lot of it's generational, right? Like as children of parents, it's from immigrant background. It's always like save, 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 save. But
mm,
that mentality doesn't really get you to the next level in your business. So it's really at every level, I am constantly unraveling the narratives that I was born with that are no
mm,
longer serving me. And so whether it's from like the fear of being seen, right? For women of color, like we're not taught to be promoting ourselves, And so as an Asian woman, like that's even like, I was told like just keep your head down. So now I'm teaching people how to make some noise about their business. So again, it's very against kind of what I've been taught. I've been taught to save. I've been taught to, just not spend my money. And now I'm actively trying to invest in my business and give it what it needs to grow, which is again a very unnatural thing for me. And so at every level, it's always doing something that is like so against what you've been wired to do. And it's a lot of looking at the generational things that we were taught and to just kind of let that go.
mm. Oh, I love that you mentioned that because I've seen that in my own entrepreneurship journey and in my work as a coach. There's a lot of things that we need to work through that we might not even be aware of at first. And I see
Yeah.
this as I coach leaders at companies. Like there's a lot of culture things that impact how we show up. And cultural, I have a company I work with, they call it cultural scripts that we have that might be different from the cultural scripts of corporate America or
Mm.
the US. And so it's interesting you bring that up because it's true.
Yeah, it's a really powerful journey to unravel that. And it's frightening. But then when you start to realize why is it that this didn't work out? Or why is it that you start to trace it back to like your parents and the way that you were brought up and the household. So it's really deep stuff. And a lot of times it forces us to peek into parts of ourselves that we have been avoiding for a long time. So
Hmm.
that's why I say it's kind of like the best form of therapy in playing out in real life because you actually do see the repercussions of how you make decisions. And then you get to examine after you failed, like, oh, so that's what happened. Or I'm a
Hmm.
micromanager because, oh, I have trust issues. And where did I get trust issues? And, or like money issues. Where did that come from? So
Hmm.
constantly you have to question yourself to understand why those patterns of behaviors happen so that you can change it.
Hmm. Oh, I love that you mentioned that. I once heard someone say that entrepreneurship is the biggest personal development project that we can ever embark on because yeah, all of our insecurities, all the things we maybe even more were aware of that we struggle with come up. And I love that you mentioned the worthiness piece. I saw that in my own kind of business. What am I going to charge? Am
Ooh,
I
good
worthy of
one.
that? Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
playing with the pricing. And for me, there was this belief that you have to work hard for money. Like it has to be really hard because I think that's kind of what I saw with my parents. And that maybe I had to question that because I love what I do. And so it doesn't necessarily feel hard because I love what I do and I can be compensated for that. And so, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But we got to step in that frequency. I always say, like, we got to promote ourselves with the confidence of a mediocre white dude, right? I think it's hard for us. And so we're doing this work together and inviting others just to do the same. But it definitely, I think as a woman of color, we have a special set of narratives and constraints that, that just make it a little bit harder for us, especially in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, yeah. And it makes it very rewarding when we figure it out and then we can
Hmm.
unlock that for other women who might have similar struggles, which
Sure.
I'm sure there's someone listening who is nodding their head right now.
Hmm.
So, what do you want to say to someone, Gloria, who is maybe thinking about pivoting in their career, thinking maybe my personality isn't necessarily fitting the role I'm in? Maybe my gifts can be used somewhere else. What would you say to that person listening?
Well, like Oprah says, if you do what you love, the money will come. That's obviously like simplifying it. But if you follow something like if you are having a chat with your friend and you realize that like something really lights you up, or if you're the person that your friends go to for X, Y, and Z, whatever that innate skill is, whether it's communication, whether it's listening, empathy, strategy, operations, you can apply it to something. So yes, like I am in PR because I love to make people feel seen, but making people feel seen can be translated in many different ways. But you have
Hmm.
to figure out what is your magic thing that you bring. And so for me, it's making people feel seen, and I love to see people win. So I'm
Hmm.
doing that with PR. So it could be something different for you, right? It could be strategy. It could be analyzing a situation. For example, my husband will never be an entrepreneur because he likes to be in part of a bigger thing, and he's not a creative thinker. He's not a salesperson. So it's going to be hard for him to be an entrepreneur where you're constantly having to do sales. So I think it's just important to figure out what is our personality and understand that first, and then figure out how we can apply for it.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that your husband's any less, because he's in, like, it was just figuring out what is it that we love and how can we show up and use those gifts in the role that's best for us.
Yeah. And if he does want to start his own thing, he can partner with someone who is a good salesperson and have a co-founder, right? But I think that as entrepreneurs, learning how to sell is like very intrinsic to what we have to do, but there are ways around it. He's more of a strategy person, right? So I'm like the big picture person. Everything else is kind of a mess, but he's like, okay, well, how do we actually get there? And we need people like that. We can't have everyone be big visionary thinkers. So.
Well, Gloria, thank you so much for being here today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. How can people learn more about you? How can people learn about your work with you? Tell us all the things.
Well, I'm at Gloria Chou PR. So that's Gloria Chou PR on social media. I also have a podcast called Small Business PR where we really make PR accessible. I ask all the questions you can't Google. So how do you get featured? How do you get on a podcast? If you have a product, how do you get into a gift guide? All those things. And those are the ways that I serve and show up. My community is mainly women of color, and it's the most rewarding journey to see them go bigger with their message and really see their passion project be something more and feel like really confident to pitch it out there. So
thank you so much. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this show. I hope that you found the episode helpful. And if you like the show, please subscribe and don't forget to rate and review. I'd also love to connect on Instagram. Send me a DM. I'm at Lupe Prado Coaching. I'll talk to you soon.